Imagine this, an ordinary evening, a noisy street, a group of teenagers hurling derogatory words, laughing, not realizing that their insolent taunts will soon turn against them. They have surrounded a black man, and it seems that their insolence and prejudice know their limits, but they have no idea that his response will cause them to freeze and think deeply about their own words and actions. Now imagine yourself in the shoes of a random passerby who witnesses this tense scene. What would you do? Write your name and where you are watching this video from in the comments. You are very important to us. Every comment and view helps promote our channel and supports us in creating stories like this. We feel your support and it really inspires us. Twilight slowly enveloped the city, and the bustling city park filled with life. The sweet smell of popcorn and roasted corn wafted through the air from the street vendors. The light from streetlights broke on the wet tiles of the walkways, creating playful shadows. Laughing teenagers gathered in groups, their voices melded into a single stream. Jokes, stories about the weekend, the sounds of a ball game that occasionally broke the rhythm of the evening symphony. Some of them Saturday on the grass, exchanging secret conversations, while others were actively discussing the latest news from social media. Every laugh and every scream epitomized a carefree and youthfulness that never seemed to leave them. These evenings had become routine, but there was a certain tension in the air that day that went unnoticed by most. The park was full of teenagers, their scowling faces and loud voices, creating an atmosphere of mild aggression that was becoming more palpable by the moment. Boys and girls looked cocky, laughing and encouraging each other to be more daring. And amidst this teeming crowd, a black-skinned man appeared on the horizon, walking peacefully down the alley, unaware that a wave of hatred and prejudice was being directed in his direction. He looked calm and confident, but to the teenagers he was a target. The eyes of some of them lit up when they noticed him. Their displeasure quickly turned to outright ridicule. Laughter and insults rang out like ringing buzzers, disrupting the harmony of the evening, setting the backdrop for the drama to come. At the center of this evening drama was a group of teenagers who were bound together not only by friendship, but also by a common bias. They were ordinary kids from neighboring neighborhoods, often gathering in the park to spend time away from the eyes of their parents. Each of them had a different personality, but they all shared one thing in common: stereotypes and preconceived notions about people who were different from them. Dan was their informal leader, tall and pumped up, with a scowl on his face and a permanent smirk. He always wanted to be the center of attention and considered himself the protector of his group. Dan was the one who was the first to raise his voice when a new victim came into their company. He truly believed that humiliating others raised his own status among his peers. Tom, his best friend, was less aggressive but secretly admired Dan. He often agreed, wanting to be on topic and not stand out from the crowd. Tom wasn't too interested in his own position. It was important for him to be part of the group, even if it meant supporting racist jokes and ridicule. Lisa and Sarah were friends who delighted in the opportunity to participate in the discussion. Their laughter was bright but superficial, often coming from fear of being rejected. They did not think about their words and actions, following the general mood of the group, assuming they were just harmless jokes. Finally, Mike, the youngest in the company, always sought the approval of his elders. He was not mean, but his insecurity sometimes led to cruel remarks. He longed for recognition, which is why he engaged in ridicule, even when he felt it was wrong. Gathered together, they had more than once considered that they had their own fears and doubts, but preferred to ignore them, slipping into habitual role-playing. Their bias was not something conscious. Rather, it was a product of an environment where stereotypes substituted for reality. When the black man became visible on the horizon, they instantly felt excited, like hunters spotting their prey. A frown of anticipation appeared in the eyes of the teenagers. They were already anticipating how they could unleash their aggression under the mask of friendship and fun. It seemed like a harmless game on their part, but to a man who just wanted to spend the evening peacefully, it portended something else entirely. When the black man entered the teenagers' field of vision, their conversations momentarily died down. And then, as if on cue, filled with quiet whispers and giggles again, he walked confidently, with a straight back and a calm face. But this only served to inflame the group's interest. They exchanged glances that were already filled with mockery and bewilderment. Dan was the first to notice the man, and leaning over to the others, said with an obvious sneer, "Look who's here. I hope he has green cards to get into the party." His words elicited friendly laughter, and the other teens continued to pick up the theme. Tom, blushing slightly with laughter, added, "I hope it doesn't stay too long, or we won't be able to breathe from his flavor." These words resounded amidst the general laughter, and their malicious merriment only increased. Each new remark became more and more offensive, as if they were competing in the skill of humiliation. Lisa and Sarah, agreeing, began to add their comments while their laughter grew louder and louder. "He obviously came from another planet," Lisa pronounced, giggling how only his parents let him into the park. Sarah put in, and her words elicited laughter again. They felt like the masters of this situation, playing off every stereotype they'd ever heard and using them as a weapon against anyone who looked different. The man, unsuspecting, continued to walk past, his eyes forward and his thoughts far away from the crowd laughing behind him. He did not realize that this evening he had become the object of their hatred, a symbol of what they feared and did not understand. The teens continued to joke and wink at each other, not realizing that their words and laughter exposed not only their biases but also their own weaknesses. They thought they were making fun of someone else, but in fact, their behavior only highlighted how weak they themselves were when it came to showing real courage and humanity. And at that moment, as the laughter reached its peak, the black-skinned man suddenly stopped and turned around. His gaze was focused and calm, causing the teens to freeze in place. Excitement ran through the crowd, and the realization that their teasing laughter could backfire on them began to be felt in the air. The black-skinned man stopped and turned around to become the center of attention, and tension hung in the air. Watching his calmness, the teens felt the confidence begin to leave them. It was a moment when they had to decide how to proceed, and that's when Dan decided to strike the first blow. With a smirk that barely concealed his evil intent, he stepped forward, leaning in the fashion of a teenage bully. "Hey, bro," he shouted, pretending to address the man. "You wouldn't happen to be lost, would you? This isn't a zoo." His words were full of contempt and hatred, and the group's laughter rose as if they had just heard the funniest joke. This first attack was the signal for the others. Tom, feeling a surge of courage sweep over him, picked up the joke. "I hope you have a permit to stay in our neighborhood. We don't have room for the likes of you here." His voice sounded harsh, like a knife stabbing into a wound, and the teens rolled with laughter again, unaware of how deeply their words hurt. Lisa and Sarah, keeping up with their friends, began shouting their insults while giggling. "Hey, aren't you ashamed to be hanging around here? Please go back to your burrows," Lisa yelled, and Sarah added, "If you don't have a job, maybe you should go back to your burrows." They could feel each other's encouragement building up in their angry remarks. Amidst all this, Mike, who was always looking for approval, stepped closer to the group, barely containing his laughter. "Damn, don't you guys even realize what you're doing? This is just pathetic." It was as if he was looking for confirmation that his mockery was also part of the adventure. However, while the teens continued to shower the man with streams of racist comments, he seemed to remain unruffled. His face remained calm, which left the teens confused. At this point, as aggression began to escalate, Dan decided that their bullying wasn't bad enough. He stepped closer, cocking his chin defiantly. "Do you even realize what you're doing wrong?" he pronounced with disdain. "You don't want us to call in our friends to explain to you how to behave, do you?" His threat hung in the air like a dark cloud, and the teenagers' laughter grew louder. They were trying to prove that their group spirit was stronger than any respect or humanity. In this heady sense of power, they did not realize that they themselves were victims of their own prejudices, and their angry words only emphasized their weakness and fear of what they could not understand. The black-skinned man continued to stare at them, and in his eyes flashed not hatred, but something deeper, the realization that the teenagers' hatred was just a reflection of their own insecurity and fear. With each passing minute, the teenagers' laughter became more and more hysterical, and their confidence grew like a snowball rolling over the victim. They felt that their collective aggression made them invincible, and each new derogatory comment only added to their courage. Dan, as the prime mover, took on an almost fake aura of authority. His voice grew louder and louder as he shouted insults, turning it into a game where the stakes were their own self-confidence. "Hey, look at him," he shouted, pointing his finger. "Do you have a problem with looking like a normal person? Maybe your big brother is a puddle of mud." This comment caused an explosion of laughter, The teenagers, as if bewitched, continued to stir up an atmosphere of hatred, each trying to outdo the other in cruelty. Tom, who usually lacked courage, began to break into the conversation. Why don't you use your dreadlocks as a sail at all? Suddenly they'll carry you back to your slumbering village. Each derogatory word sharpened the atmosphere, penetrating the man's heart like a chilling chill. The teenagers did not realize that their words were insulting not only him, but themselves. They acted like a pack that had lost all notion of humanity and compassion. Lisa and Sarah picked up the baton, starting to make comments about his clothes. Where are you going in those old pants? Lisa asked, giggling. Maybe you're trying to be a rapper. Come on, let us hear your tracks. Each new insult rained down on the man like hailstones on a defenseless shield. Their words, filled with venom and hatred, cut like knives, making him feel that he was not just a victim of ridicule, but a symbol of everything they did not understand or accept. Mike, still under the influence of the band, blurted out, don't you think you should go back where you came from? We have our own order here, and you're not following it. These words, though spoken with uncertainty, rang in the ear like the final nail in the coffin of humanity. The man, deep down realizing that they were just teenagers, naively trying their hand at aggression, nevertheless felt each attack becoming more and more painful. He couldn't ignore their words, and in that moment, he felt the weight of not only his loneliness, but also the fact that he was on the edge of the abyss these young bullies had created. The teens continued to have fun, oblivious to the growing tension around them. Each of them was sure that it was their words and actions that made them more meaningful, but in reality, they were just accumulating karma that would one day require payback. They were enjoying the moment, not realizing that in their attempts to humiliate the other, they were actually humiliating themselves. As the teenagers continued to taunt the black man, passersby began to gather around. Some of them initially passed by, absorbed in their own thoughts and activities, but soon stopped, catching the tension and anger in the air. Groups of people enjoying their evening strolls suddenly began to realize that something terrible was happening. An elderly woman walking her dog Francie in her stride, as her gaze fell on the angry group of teenagers. She furrowed her eyebrows, her face contorted with bewilderment. Her heart beat faster when she saw one of the boys laughing, stretching out his arm to point at the man, as if he were some kind of strange creature. What is this outrage? She whispered, continuing to watch with her mouth open. Different feelings were struggling inside her. From anger to regret, she didn't know what to do. It was as if an invisible force was holding her in place, and she felt she should intervene, but fear of the possible consequences held her back. Among the passersby was a young couple who couldn't believe their ears. Did you hear what they're saying? Whispered the guy to his girlfriend, looking at the group in disgust. It's just crazy. She only nodded, feeling the anger building up in their hearts. Something has to be done, she uttered, trying to keep her composure. Some of the onlookers, in complete shock, began to move closer, but most remained at a distance, as if protecting themselves from a possible confrontation. Society often ignored such incidents, turning a blind eye to the blatant display of hatred. But today was different. Tensions were rising, and many of the bystanders realized that simply standing aside was wrong. It's not normal, is it? Shouted one of the men, standing on the other side of the park. His voice awakened those around him, and a few people began to gather, looking at the scene with disapproval. The group of teenagers, sensing the stares, hesitated for a moment, but when they saw that most of the passersby were staying away, they regained their confidence. Dan, noticing the new witnesses, smirked and shouted, "Hey, what are you watching? You don't like our show?" This elicited additional laughter from his friends, but there was something more in the eyes of those passing by. It was condemnation, the realization that they were witnessing outright evil. Several people began to gather in a small circle, casting scornful glances at the teenagers. "Are you guys serious?" muttered one of the men, addressing the group. "This behavior is unacceptable." He wasn't going to just watch, and his boldness inspired others to take action. The teenagers, seeing the adults starting to join them, began to get nervous. At that moment, the black man, who had previously endured humiliation, felt the support of passersby. Hope was born in his heart. He realized that perhaps he was not alone, and that there was a counter to the hatred and prejudice. Despite the insults and taunts directed at him, the black man kept moving forward, as if an invisible barrier protected him from the anger of others. His steps were confident and deliberate, and his face remained calm, even though his emotions were stirring. He knew he shouldn't let a group of teenagers break his spirit. Every derogatory word, every contemptuous expression tried to undermine his confidence, but he found the strength to ignore them. More and more people were gathering around him to witness what was happening, and it gave him added confidence. He didn't want to be a victim, didn't want to let them win. Don't let them take away your power, he whispered to himself in his head, remembering the times he had to fight bias in his life. He knew that these situations were everywhere, and that you had to be strong to stand up to them. Dan, noticing that their victim wasn't paying attention to the bully, shrieked, "Hey, you, can you hear us? Maybe it's time to stop and respond like a normal person. Or are you just standing there to show everyone how you can't behave?" There was a mixture of anger and confusion in his voice. He didn't understand how you could just ignore his words as if they didn't matter. The man shook his head slightly without turning around, sensing the power hidden in his silence. He realized that this was just a way for the teenagers to assert themselves, a way to deal with their own fears. He wasn't going to become part of the game. As he continued walking, more people from the crowd began to approach him. Some whispered words of encouragement. Others just looked on with sympathy. Each warm smile gave him strength. He felt that his efforts did not go unnoticed, that he was not alone in his struggle. Lisa and Sarah continued to laugh, but their laughter became less confident. They were beginning to realize that their victim wasn't going to give up, and it was throwing them into confusion. "Why doesn't he just get out?" Lisa whispered, and her voice betrayed nervousness. The man, feeling the support around him, gathered all his inner strength and finally turned to the group. His gaze was fixed, full of dignity. "You can laugh all you want," he said, his voice deep and confident, "but not one word of yours defines me. I know who I am, and your hatred cannot break me." These words, spoken with absolute calmness, struck the group instantly. The teenagers frowned, and the air around them seemed to thicken with tension. It was the moment when hatred and contempt began to collide with strength and resilience. The black-skinned man continued forward, ignoring the chuckles and prejudice, and there was something majestic about it. He knew his path wasn't easy, but his determination and composure were his real strength. And even though he was now alone against the entire crowd, he felt that the fight for justice was never in vain. The teenagers, sensing that their initial aggression had not worked, became even more aggressive, and their screams filled the park with a roar of hatred. Laughter changed to rage, and their faces contorted with anger, as if they were transformed into monsters that had completely lost their human form. Dan, sensing that his authority was being questioned, stepped forward, his voice harsh and threatening. "You still think you can just walk by and ignore us? How pathetic you are," he shouted, his words sharper than a knife. Hatred glittered in his eyes, and he was ready to cross all boundaries. The teenagers began to exchange glances, and as if in a single impulse, began shouting increasingly cruel insults. Tom leaned forward, and his voice became quiet but full of anger. "Hey, if you're so proud, why don't you show me what you've got? You've probably never met a real man, have you?" His words were full of contempt, and this teasing spurred them on even more. Lisa and Sarah didn't stay away. "What? You don't have any friends to come to the rescue? Or are they all just like you just heard in the street?" Lisa shouted, teasingly clenching her fists as if ready for a fight. Her words weren't just insults, they were a deliberate humiliation intended to make the man feel isolated and defenseless. The teenagers' laughter grew louder and louder, their energy rising like steam from a boiling pot. Mike, wanting to assert his place in the group, added, "Why don't you go back to your own before it's too late? This isn't your neighborhood." His words sounded like a defiant shout, trying to stir up more hatred. Realizing that their confidence was not tame, the teenagers began to approach the man, forming a tight circle, as if they were going to put on a show to humiliate him. Their bodies pressed together, and the man could feel the threat growing, as if they were becoming a single living organism moving toward violence. Dan took a step closer and, rolling his eyes, said, "You know, I feel like you're just missing from our show. Why don't you come help us out? Just tell us how it's going in your country and we'll all have a laugh." His words were sheer audacity, awakening primal instincts in the other teens. The man knew they were becoming more aggressive and dangerous, but a spark of confidence continued to burn in his heart. He stood up straight, raising his head as if it were his last shield against their hatred. Despite all the violence, he felt there was a strength within him that they could never break. The teens, sensing the growing tension, were no longer shy in expressing their hatred. "Why don't you just come out with us and show us what you're really like? Or are you just covering yourself with that black hide of yours?" Sarah shouted, and her words rang out like thunder. These insults, full of anger and malice, were now turning into physical threats. The teenagers continued to escalate the atmosphere, and the man realized that this could soon escalate into something more dangerous. He took a deep breath, inhaling the night air, preparing himself for what might happen next. The teens, pumped up by their aggression and supported by the laughter of their peers, began looking for a way to push the situation to the limit. Sensing that their insults had reached the maximum, Dan stepped even closer to the man and leaned in and said with a challenge, "Look, if you're so tough, why don't you respond to what we're saying? You're just standing there like a monument, and we're here to have some fun. Come on, show us what you got." His words were like a spark, igniting the excitement of the crowd. The teenagers frowned in anticipation, like spectators before a fight, eager to see how the man would react to their provocation. Dan's eyes glittered with anger, and it took a step back to form a space for a possible confrontation. He knew it could lead to violence, but at the moment, it was the only way to preserve his reputation in the eyes of his friends. Mike, standing slightly behind him, picked up on his words. "You're not just going to stand there and ignore us, are you? It's awful to be a nobody when you don't have the courage to say anything back. Or are you just afraid we'll show you who's boss?" This provocative incitement was the last straw. The atmosphere around them had heated up to the limit, and every teenager expected the man to fight back. They could not allow their victim to just stand idly by while they tried so hard to get a reaction. The black-skinned man felt their gazes bearing down on him, full of anticipation and readiness for action. He realized that this was their last move in this game to make him feel vulnerable and force him to respond to their provocations. He took a deep breath, realizing that what he needed now was resilience, not rage. "I'm not going to stoop to your level," he said calmly, his voice clear and confident. "I will not respond to your hatred. Your words have no meaning to me. I know who I am, and you can't change that." These words were spoken so loudly that the people around him frowned in anticipation. Some passersby, still watching the situation, began to rise, determined to support the man. There was an expression of sympathy in their eyes, but also anger at the behavior of the teenagers. However, the teens, unwilling to relent, only grew more heated at his words. Tongue, sensing that the situation was slipping out of their control, shouted, "What? You don't know how to behave? You're just another coward hiding behind your mask." His words sounded like he was trying to regain lost control of the situation, but instead only increased the tension. The man, realizing that his resilience was not only a test for him, but an important moment for everyone present, took a pause. He looked at the teenagers, and a spark of strength flashed in his eyes that was far stronger than their hatred. "I am not afraid of you," he uttered without averting his gaze. "Your words only reflect who you are, and I'm not going to play your game." These words triggered a new wave of anger in the teenagers, and desperation became visible in their eyes. They began to feel that they were losing control, and this only fueled their aggression. Each new insult, each provocation became a step towards escalating the conflict. The man standing in front of them knew that he had to remain steadfast despite all the threats and provocations, and that it had perhaps become a symbol of the fight against the hatred growing around him. At the moment when the aggression of the teenagers reached its peak, the black-skinned man stopped. He turned to face them, and his expression betrayed neither fear nor confusion. There was a calmness in his eyes that seemed to stand in contrast to the hatred raging around him. That look of certainty made the group stand still for a moment, as if they were facing an impregnable wall. The man took a deep breath, trying to focus. His heart was racing, but there was no panic in that rhythm, only determination. He knew that now was the decisive moment. He wasn't going to reciprocate their rage, wasn't going to sink to the level where hate became the only language of communication. Instead, he decided to use his words as weapons. "You think your insults can hurt me?" he said, his voice smooth and deep, like water with a lot of power hidden in it. "You think your hatred will make you stronger, but in truth it only shows how weak you are." His words sounded confident, and the teens, though still angry, began to feel that their attacks were having no effect. At this time, passers-by, watching what was happening, began to come closer, their interest in this situation growing. The man felt their support, and it gave him strength. He knew they were not just spectators. they could witness hatred colliding with courage. The teens in the midst of their growing aggression noticed that their hate spells weren't working, and that only fueled their rage. Dan stepped forward, his face red with anger. Do you really think your words matter? We don't care what you say out there. We're here to show you who's in charge. However, despite his words, the man's expression remained calm. He wasn't going to respond to the provocation. Instead, he looked at them with sympathy and even slight sadness. Don't you realize that all these insults only reflect your fears? I'm here to help you realize that. The man knew that this situation could easily get out of hand, but his inner voice told him that he couldn't let his emotions get the best of him. He was living proof that resilience and confidence could stand up to hatred. The aggression of the teenagers didn't subside, and the tension grew with each passing second, but he continued to stare at them, not looking away as if he was defying their attacks. Your words don't make me less, but they do make you more vulnerable. Think about it, he said, and his voice grew even louder and sharper. The assembled passersby, sensing the rising tension, began to exchange glances. Realizing that they could be part of something important, they could witness how one life could change the perception of many. The man continued to stand before them as the living embodiment of strength and fortitude. He knew that this was not just a fight for his honor, but an opportunity to change the mindset of these teenagers. He needed to hold out, and he believed that even if the storm broke, he would remain steadfast. This was the calm before the storm, and he was preparing to face it with dignity. There was tension in the air, as if before a thunderstorm. The black-skinned man gathered all his inner strength and, looking into the eyes of the teenagers, began to speak, his voice as calm and confident as a steady stream of water. I am not here to quarrel with your stupid insults, he said, and his words echoed through the crowd like waves on the surface of a calm lake. I am here to remind you that all of us, regardless of color or background, have the same value. Every hate-filled word you say only emphasizes your insecurity and fear of what is different from you, he added, his voice not rising but not weakening either, giving his speech incredible power. With every word he spoke, the atmosphere around him began to change. The passersby, who had been simply watching before, now began to clench into fists, realizing the significance of the moment. They could feel his confidence filling the space, overcoming the hatred that had filled it. I'm not going to let you devalue me. I came here as a human being, not as an object of your anger. You can try to belittle me, but I know who I am, and that's not going to change because of what you say, he continued, keeping his eyes on the group of teenagers who were beginning to look confused under his gaze. Tom, still trying to retain his influence, searched for words to reply, but the man continued without giving them a chance to interrupt him. Each of you has the opportunity to change your lives and your views. You don't have to be part of this hatred. You can choose a different path, a path of understanding and respect. Despite the teenagers' protests, his words resonated in the air like the sound of a gong, echoing off the walls of the park. The teens began to realize that their aggression could not achieve the desired result. Instead of humiliating the man, he had become their mirror, showing them who they really were. I grew up in a world full of bias, and every time I faced hate, I found the strength to keep going, he said with dignity. I knew that my worth is not determined by what others think. I refuse to be a part of your hatred, and I challenge you to do the same. It sounded like a challenge, and the teens, though trying to remain aggressive, began to feel their confidence begin to wane under the pressure of his power. They began to exchange glances, and confusion glimmered in them. Why do you choose hate over love? Why not awaken compassion within yourself? It takes much more courage than hurting others, the man continued, and his voice sounded more and more insistent, causing a sense of inner turmoil among the teenagers. The passersby began to quietly discuss among themselves, sensing that something more than a conflict was unfolding before them. They were witnessing a true display of the power of confidence that could overcome hatred. Each of them realized that this situation mattered, and each sided with the person facing the threat. The man continued to speak like a light breaking through the clouds. He knew that words could be powerful weapons, and he used them to ignite a spark of understanding among those who were lost in hatred. This strength of confidence he displayed became an unshakable shield against ridicule and cruelty, and everyone could feel its resonating influence in the air. The words of the black man, full of wisdom and depth, seemed to resonate in every corner of the park. The teenagers, who had previously been sure of their power, began to feel their aggression weakening under his calmness. He spoke in such a way that his voice sounded like a melody, taking them to another dimension where hate had no power. The word is not just a sound. It has the power to destroy or, on the contrary, to heal. You can choose how you use your power. He continued, his words seeming to penetrate the hearts of his listeners. His gaze was penetrating, and he seemed to look into the very core of each teenager, making them feel not only his hatred but also his own despair. Dan, who had recently been the chief provocateur, stood in a daze. Uncertainty flickered in his eyes, and he couldn't find the words to answer. His stubbornness began to weaken as he realized that there was more going on here than just a game of humiliation. You speak of my need to know my place, but is a man's place determined by his skin color or by his origin? A man's true place is determined by his actions, his decisions, and how he treats others, the man said, and his voice became even more emphatic. Tom, standing next to Dan, began to give in to doubt. He hadn't expected such a reaction, and his confidence that they could just break the man with their insults began to falter. What do you know about us? He finally uttered, but his voice no longer sounded so confident. I know that hate is a mask we wear to hide our fears, the man replied, and his words echoed through the crowd. But deep down, each of you desires understanding and acceptance, so why seek it in the humiliation of others? Some passersby began to encourage him with quiet words of approval, and the atmosphere gradually changed. The teenagers felt the pressure building up around them like dense clouds, ready to descend in a downpour. They stood in confusion, realizing that their hatred had suddenly become irrelevant. Your anger is just a reflection of what you can't accept in yourself, the man continued, each syllable becoming more and more convincing. When you choose hate, you close the door to opportunity. I'm not here to be your enemy, but to show you that you can choose a different path. The man's words shook even the most insolent of teenagers. Watching their confused faces, he sensed that perhaps his message was beginning to reach them. The hatred with which they approached him was a burden that grew heavier to bear with each passing second. Coming to the climax of his address, he pronounced, "Courage is not about insulting others, but about realizing that there is more to us than that. We are all on this path, the path to understanding, love, and respect." With this unexpected answer, he created a space for reflection, leaving no room for aggression. And at that moment, whispers and quiet conversations were heard among the crowd of teenagers as they began to exchange hesitant glances, as if seeking comfort from each other. The unexpected power of his answer pierced their hearts, and perhaps they began to realize that hatred could never eclipse the light that comes from understanding and respect. The crowd of teenagers frowned in anticipation as the black man's words continued to echo in their heads. His calmness and confidence seemed to bear their souls, causing each of them to wonder, "What are we doing?" There was confusion in the eyes of some of them, and in others a fleeting realization that their behavior was wrong. Dan, who had once been the soul of the company, stood with his arms crossed, but now they were trembling with tension. He exchanged glances with the others, trying to find in them confirmation of his former beliefs, but met only bewilderment and fear. What if he's right? He thought, not knowing how to deal with it. The feeling was becoming more intolerable by the moment. Tom took a step back, his confidence beginning to crack at the seams. He looked at his friend, his face full of inner struggle. Around them stood the others, immersed in thought. They couldn't ignore what was really going on. Every insult they had uttered now seemed deafening and meaningless to them. "Is it really so?" whispered Sam, one of the less aggressive members of the group, thinking out loud. "We're not like that. We're just..." He paused, not knowing how to continue, but everyone in the group felt that his words carried weight. The hatred they had been going at the man with now seemed disgusting. The passersby, still watching the situation, began to whisper among themselves, realizing that something important was happening. Their gazes were full of understanding and support, as if they were becoming part of this inner upheaval that was taking place in the minds of the teenagers. Some of them started pulling out their phones, preparing to capture this moment when hatred collided with understanding. The black man, watching, felt that his words were finally beginning to reach his listeners. He was ready to support them in this new journey. "Listen," he said, his voice now sounding softer, almost urging, "Each of you has a right to your feelings, but when you let hate control you, you lose a part of yourself." The man's words broke through the barriers the teenagers had built themselves, They realized that everyone had their own experiences, their own fears and insecurities, and each of them was capable of changing their perceptions, if only they wanted to. Feelings of shame and confusion began to overwhelm them. I know it's hard for you to understand what I'm saying, he continued. You've grown up in a society that teaches you to hate. But here's the thing, hate won't make you stronger. It only leads to pain and frustration, and you'll end up alone, surrounded by your own despair. Some of the teens began to exchange glances, realizing that their relationship was full of conflict and hatred, and it might not be what they thought it was. Dan finally gathered his strength to say something, but his words stuck in his throat. He could feel his confidence melting away, and suddenly it was scary. I don't want to be like this, he said quietly, and his voice became subdued, full of guilt. I don't know how we got to this point, but it's wrong. That moment was the turning point. The teenagers frowned, their confidence wavering and their hearts filled with doubt. There was no longer anger in the eyes of some of them, only a desire to change something about themselves. The man, seeing that his words were beginning to bear fruit, continued, this is not an easy path, and I can't change you just by talking to you, but you can change yourself. Please don't let hate rule your life. Instead, choose understanding, choose love. With each word they spoke, the teenagers thought more and more about how their actions affected others. The atmosphere in the park had changed. Before it had been full of hatred and anger, but now there was a strange calm, as if the storm clouds were beginning to dissipate. Despite the confusion, they still couldn't completely get rid of their old habits. And what if we don't know how to do that? Uttered someone from the crowd, but it no longer sounded so threatening. It was a question, full of a genuine desire to understand, not to condemn. The man, catching that tone, replied, we all learn. It is a process, and along the way, you will have the opportunity to grow and change. Start with small steps, respect each other, listen, apply empathy, and you will see the world around you begin to change. At that moment, even the most stubborn teenagers began to realize that what stood before them was not an enemy, but a man who was willing to help them rethink their behavior. The hatred with which they had come suddenly lost its power, and in its absence something new emerged, an opportunity for change. Thus, the moment they frowned, their hearts began to open to new ideas and possibilities. Each of them became not just a witness, but a participant in something important. When hatred receded before understanding, the black man stood in front of the teenagers, feeling the first glimmers of understanding begin to show in their eyes. He decided it was time to share his story, a story of struggle, pain, and ultimately hope. He knew this could be a turning point, not only for them, but for himself. I grew up in a world where racism and prejudice were an everyday reality. He began, his voice full of deep sincerity. From a very young age, I realized that my skin could be the cause of hate, not love. I faced hateful stares, insults, and even physical violence simply for who I am. As he spoke, the teens began to realize that his words were not just abstract concepts, but deep and personal experiences. They looked at him as a man who had overcome tremendous challenges. He continued, I remember being the object of ridicule at school. My classmates would often use racist jokes. They thought it was funny. I would go home feeling devastated. But with each new day, I realized those words couldn't define me. A man stood still for a moment, his eyes deep and full of memories. At that moment, I realized if I let them break me, they would win. I couldn't let them rob me of myself, of my dignity. He looked at the teenagers, seeing them immerse themselves in his story, their interest growing. I began to look for ways to overcome my pain. Instead of giving in to hate, I chose the path of respect and understanding. He said, his voice becoming more confident. I started studying, reading, talking to people from different cultures. I realized that each person is not just a shell, but a whole world with its own history, suffering, and hopes. The teens exchanged glances, and some of them began to realize that they themselves might have similar experiences, not related to skin color, but perhaps in other ways. I'm not saying it was easy. There were days when I doubted, when I thought about giving up. He continued, his voice quieter but full of strength. But it was in those moments that I found support in people who really understood me. I started working with youth, doing what I could to help others go through the same struggles. He was silent for a moment to give the teens time to comprehend his words. My life has not only been full of suffering, it has also been full of love and support. I met people who became my friends, and they showed me that the world could be kind. It was this realization that gave me the strength to move on. He went on to talk about how he had teachers and mentors in his life who inspired him. They opened my eyes to the fact that our strength lies in respecting others. We are all unique, and that uniqueness should be celebrated, not suppressed. When I began to appreciate people for their differences, I became stronger. His story became not only a personal confession, but also a lesson for teenagers. He continued, "I know that there are those among you who, like me, face difficulties. You can choose how to respond to it through hate or through love. Respect is a powerful tool that can change your life and the lives of those around you." Some teens began to nod, realizing that it was respect that could be the basis for their change. Remember that your choices have consequences. Every time you choose to treat someone with respect, you strengthen your own spirit. He said, and his voice became like a rallying bell that rings in everyone's heart. The man's words evolved like waves washing ashore. He added, "When you see someone who is different from you, instead of feeling fear or hatred, try approaching them with an open heart. Allow yourself to get to know them, and you will see how it will change you." Conversations full of questions began to emerge among the teenagers. They began to realize that their former confidence in their rightness was nothing more than an illusion. "What can we do?" one of them asked, his voice sounding not like a challenge but a sincere question. "Start with yourself," the man replied. "Start listening, understanding, and respecting. Every action you take can be a step toward change. It won't be instantaneous, but every step is a step toward a brighter future, both for you and for others." In that moment, as they frowned, staring into his face, the teens began to realize that respect was more than just a word. It is a force that can break down the walls of hatred and prejudice that they themselves have erected. And perhaps because of his story, they began to realize that they had the power to change not only their lives, but the lives of those around them. Like a warm light breaking through the clouds, the power of respect began to fill the space. Each of the teens felt that they could be part of this process, a process that began with themselves. As soon as the black-skinned man's words flew into the air, there was silence all around. The tension became palpable, like a thick fog enveloping everyone who stood in the park. The teenagers, who moments ago had been humoring him with loud laughter, now frowned as if someone had pressed the pause button. Their smiles faded, and the confidence with which they had stored their insults seemed to melt away like morning frost in the sun. Each of them felt awkward and vulnerable, and in that moment, they began to realize that their earlier actions were not just jokes, they were a manifestation of hatred. Tom, who had previously laughed with gusto at the insults, now stood with his head down, confusion in his eyes. "What have I been doing?" he whispered to himself, unable to cope with the feeling of shame. Next to him, Dan clenched his fists, realizing that his laughter sounded not like mirth, but a sign of weakness. The other teenagers looked at each other, exchanging anxious glances, as if seeking comfort and understanding in each other. But uncertainty was written all over their faces. Their world, where ridicule and aggression had seemed the norm, was suddenly empty, and their long-standing attachment to hatred suddenly seemed absurd. For a moment there was complete silence in the park, only the sounds of the evening city resounding in the distance. The passers-by who were watching this situation became part of this pulse, their gazes full of sympathy and understanding. They sensed that something important was happening here and now, something that could change not only the teenagers, but also themselves. The black-skinned man noticed this change. He had seen teenagers, previously full of defiance, begin to realize that laughter was not just a reaction. It was a weapon that could hurt. He decided to use this moment to deepen their understanding. "You may laugh, but don't forget that behind every word is a person," he said, his voice full of strength and understanding. "I'm not here to judge you. I just want you to think about what it means to be human in our world. We are all here to learn from each other." His words hung in the air like a call to action, and the teenagers began to move as if awakening from a long sleep. Tsao, the quietest of the group, stood up and spoke. "I never really thought about what I was doing. It just seemed normal." His voice was full of sincerity, and in that statement was a desire to change himself. The others reacted to his words. Tom nodded, adding, "Me too. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just didn't know what it was like to be judged for who you are." These words were spoken by the others, and soon the teens began to share their experiences and fears, which they hid under a mask of aggression. Meanwhile, the man took his time. he realized that the process of realization took time. That's the first step, he said, recognizing that you have biases and fears. It's important to be able to hear others, their stories, their suffering, and only then can you get rid of hate. Each of the teenagers felt the tension in their change. The silence, which at first seemed overwhelming, now became a space for reflection and self-reflection. Instead of hiding behind laughter, they began to look at the world with new eyes. They realized that their behavior had consequences, and that those suffering from hate were not just strangers, but real people with real experiences. Meanwhile, hope was brewing in their hearts, hope that they could change not only their behavior, but also the way they perceived the world around them. One of the teens, Eric, raised his hand as if about to ask a question. What if we want to change this? How can we start? His voice was full of eagerness. The man smiled, feeling that he was opening a new window of opportunity. Start with simple steps, he replied. Start with respect. Talk to people you haven't noticed before. Listen to their stories, their experiences. You might see in them a reflection of yourself. And in that moment, the pause for laughter turned into a pause for realization. The teenagers who had once laughed began to see themselves and their tribesmen in a new light. This evening in the noisy park, which had begun with hatred and prejudice, was now the beginning of a journey of respect and understanding that was about to change the lives of all who were here. As the silence enveloping the park began to dissipate, each teenager began to sink into his or her own thoughts. This pause in laughter not only opened their eyes to reality, but also set off a chain of internal conflicts, each unique and profound. In this discussion was not only the confrontation between good and evil, but also the struggle with themselves. Tom, who had previously prided himself on his aggressive stance, felt his inner demons begin to torment him. Memories of him laughing at others, encouraging his friends, and cheering them up came to mind. Why was I doing that? He wondered, looking at his former associates. I never wanted to be the one to hurt others. Maybe I was just trying to show that I wasn't weak. He realized that his previous behavior had only been an attempt to cover up his own insecurities, and that realization was weighing on his heart. Meanwhile, Dan clenched his fists, too, images of his bias-filled life flashing through his mind. He couldn't help but remember how his family had sometimes made derogatory remarks about others. It was like it was the norm. He felt like a traitor, realizing that he carried it over to others just to feed him. I don't want to be like that, he finally decided, realizing that his own fears had made him part of a system he now despised. Sam and Eric, who had always been quiet and avoided conflict, were also beginning to feel an internal struggle. I was just observing, Sam said quietly, but his words came out louder than he expected. I never intervened when I had to, but I didn't oppose it either. I didn't want to look weak in their eyes. His mind filled with shame, and he realized that silence was not just a passive action, but a collaboration with hatred. He promised himself that he would no longer remain in the shadows. Eric, too, faced internal contradictions. He had always been someone who espoused friendliness and kindness, but even he didn't realize how sometimes his laughter at the comments of others could support a culture of ridicule. I shouldn't have laughed, he whispered. It was only reinforcing the hate. A flame of determination flared inside him and wanted to change this, but it didn't know where to start. While the teenagers were immersed in their thoughts, the black-skinned man watched them. He realized that each of them was facing an inexpressible inner conflict. It wasn't just the realization that they were wrong. It was also the realization that they had to change their attitude towards the world around them. He saw their eyes fill with anxiety and unwillingness to remain the same. You have some hard work to do, he pronounced when he felt it was time for the next step. You are now experiencing an important moment in your life. It is not just a realization, it is an opportunity to change your life and the lives of those around you. You can be the ones to break the chain of hate and prejudice. His words were the impetus that made the teenagers think about their actions and how they could affect the world. Each of them began to realize that change does not happen overnight. It requires effort, courage, and, above all, a willingness to face oneself. Tom looked up slowly, his voice full of sincerity. I don't want to be someone who poisons others. I want to be a better person. He could feel his inner conflict beginning to subside. It wasn't just a confession, it was a desire to move forward despite the difficulties. The other teens backed him up. Dan nodded. Me too. Stop hiding behind jokes. We need to show respect and understanding. he suddenly felt that his own fear of inadequacy no longer held him captive. Sam and Eric agreed. "We have to be a voice of respect," Sam added, his voice louder, and he felt the inner tension begin to subside. "Each of us can take a step toward understanding." At that moment, the black man saw a transformation take place within the group. Their inner conflicts, though painful, became the basis for change. They realized that they had a difficult road ahead of them, but this realization also gave them hope. "It will be hard, and it won't be easy," a man said, his voice becoming reminiscent of comfort. "But each of you is capable of it. Your strength lies in your willingness to change and help each other." These words were not just a reminder, but a spark that ignited their determination. Each teenager began to realize that they were not alone in this struggle. Their internal conflicts became part of a common movement, and now they could begin the journey toward understanding, respect, and ultimately acceptance. Thus, on that quiet evening, as laughter turned to confusion, hope was born in each of the teens, the hope that they could become better versions of themselves and help others overcome the same inner conflicts that once plagued them. Through the oppressive silence that reigned around them, the teens began to exchange uncertain glances. It was difficult for each of them to return to the familiar mask of confidence they had worn up to that point. They realized that every attempt to justify themselves sounded unconvincing and insufficiently sincere. Tom was the first to venture out to break the silence. "Hey, guys," he began, his voice shaking with tension. "I don't know how to explain it, but we just thought it was fun." No one wanted to hurt anyone's feelings, but the words he spoke sounded muffled, as if they had lost all meaning. He himself felt that his explanation was misplaced, as if he was trying to justify himself for something that was completely wrong. Dan backed him up, but his confidence was also beginning to waver. "Yeah, exactly. We just didn't think about it, just joking around. You know," he shrugged, as if he hoped the gesture would help smooth things over. But the more he spoke, the more realized their betrayal became. He himself could feel how his words didn't reflect a true understanding of what had happened. Watching them, the black-haired man realized that they needed time to process this transition. "Don't try to make excuses," he said calmly. "Just admit that your words and actions hurt. It doesn't mean you're bad people. It means you're learning." Meanwhile, Sam began to rise to his feet. "I feel like we didn't just hurt him. We've hurt everyone who's ever faced that kind of hatred." His voice was full of sincerity. He realized that their actions weren't just a game. This was the lives and fate of people they didn't know. Eric, always striving for kindness, sighed and looked at his friends. "I realized that each of us was wrong. I laughed when I shouldn't have, too. We were all just trying to be part of a group, but that doesn't excuse what we did." His words were a challenge to the others. He spoke of a reality that united them but at the same time alienated them. Tom felt his heart clench with shame. "I thought if I laughed with you guys, I'd be part of the team, but I didn't want that. I don't want to be the one to raise my hand against others." His voice trailed off, and he realized that now his fear of being excluded was nothing compared to how he had acted. There was awkwardness all around, and the teens began to realize that their former friendship had been built on a fragile foundation. They looked at each other, their eyes expressing confusion and sadness. Each of them felt that they did not know how to return to the norm that had once seemed so simple. Dan took a step forward. "Maybe we could do something to fix it. I don't know how to do it, but I care." His words awakened the others, and they began to think about how they could take responsibility for their actions. "We could organize a meeting at school," Sam suggested, "to discuss what happened and how we can change our behavior, and maybe invite people who have experienced racism to share their stories." His idea sounded like new hope for the group, and the teens began exchanging glances in which the spark of unity was rekindled. The black-skinned man, watching their progress, felt proud. "This is a good step," he said. "It's important not only to talk about problems, but to act. Change starts with awareness and a willingness to move forward." There was a sense of responsibility in the air. The teenagers began to realize that their actions could affect the world around them, and they were ready to take that responsibility. Each of them felt that this was not just a temporary reaction, but the beginning of a journey to a new reality where hate would have no place. Meanwhile, the evening continued to fill the park with warm light, and the teens, standing together, began to realize that it was in these moments that they were capable of change. They decided that their norm would no longer include hatred and prejudice, Instead, they would choose the path of respect and understanding. And although they knew this path would be difficult, they were willing to walk it together, supporting each other in this new chapter of their lives. There was still tension in the air, but it was beginning to give way to something more positive. The teenagers gathered in the circle continued to exchange glances full of doubt and shame. This meeting was not only an opportunity for them to realize their mistakes, but also a chance to build new relationships based on honesty and respect. Tom noticed his friends beginning to separate from their former confident images. "I can't go on like this any longer," he uttered, his voice trembling. "At that moment, when I was laughing, I didn't think about the pain I was causing others. Now that I realize it, I'm so ashamed." His eyes read sincerity, and the others began to sense that he really meant what he was saying. Dan, who had always been part of the group, agreed. "Me, too. I felt strong when I laughed at him, but really I was just hiding my weakness." His words were a revelation of sorts, and with each new phrase, he took a step closer to understanding himself. "I want to apologize, but I don't know how to do it. It was difficult." And that was what the others were saying. So, listening, began to speak. "I feel guilty too. I always thought of myself as kind, but in the moment when all of this was happening, I just stood by instead of speaking out against it. I didn't know how to react, and it was wrong." He realized that silence wasn't just passive observation, it supported aggression. Eric backed him up. "I realize a lot of us were wrong, but I feel like we can change that. We can build something new." His optimism became contagious, and others began to agree, realizing that open discussion would be the basis for change. They began talking about how to make their new relationship based on respect and understanding. Tom suggested creating a group at school that could address issues of racism and bias. "We could organize meetings, discussions, and even events to bring attention to the issue." He said enthusiastically, "It would be our way of righting wrongs and helping others." Dan nodded. "And we could invite people who have experienced racism to tell their stories. It would help us all better understand what they went through." The idea sparked a lively discussion. Everyone began to offer their thoughts and suggestions, and gradually the atmosphere began to change. They discussed how important it was not just to talk, but also to act. Sam suggested starting small, organizing joint activities that would help them get to know each other and the people around them better. "We could work together on projects that would bring us together and show that we stand for something bigger," he added. The idea of unification in action began to galvanize them. Teenagers began to realize that even though they had made mistakes, they still had the opportunity to start over. It became a challenge for them to face their fears and prejudices. Eric, realizing deep down that their new path would not be easy, still continued to believe in himself and his friends. "If we work together, we can create a space where everyone can feel safe and accepted," he said, his voice full of hope. Gradually, they began to discuss how they could change their actions in their daily lives. Each of them promised to try to be more sensitive to others and to speak out against bias wherever they encountered it. They began to make a plan to communicate their ideas to the rest of the students and to engage those who were also willing to change. With each word spoken in that circle, they felt their bond grow stronger. This was the moment when shame began to turn into strength. They realized that on the road to a new relationship, you don't have to leave your old life behind, but you have to learn from what happened and use it as a foundation for growth. Tom ended their discussion by putting his thoughts together. "Let's do this. Let's become the ones who change the world around us. Let this be our new beginning." These words sounded like a mantra, uniting them in a common goal of creating a new space of understanding and support. Thus, under a star-filled evening sky, a group of teenagers began their journey toward change. It wasn't just a desire to be better, it was a promise they made to each other and to themselves. A new phase in their lives was beginning, and they were ready to move forward, together, with respect and understanding in their hearts. The park gradually emptied, the evening silence enveloping it like a thick blanket. The black-skinned man who had catalyzed the change walked confidently away from the group of teenagers. Every step he took reflected the confidence and dignity he retained even in the heart of the conflict. He knew he was leaving behind not just a group of boys, but people who were ready to change themselves and the world around them. The teenagers stood looking after him and felt the world around them suddenly change. The path they had chosen was a real test for them. This moment was full of heaviness. They thought about their actions, about how their words could have hurt another person. Each of them realized deep down that they had become part of something much bigger, not just a conflict, but a question of justice and human dignity. Tang, still standing still, sighed and said, "I never thought I could be so cruel. The moment I left, I didn't realize it was hurting. I thought it was just a joke." His words sounded like a confession filled with heaviness. He felt that it was his choice that now haunted him like a ghost. Dan nodded in response, his expression serious. "Me, too. We've all been wrong, but what are we going to do with this information now?" He turned to the others, and everyone understood that the discussion that had just taken place was the first step toward realization. But how were they to move forward now? Sam, feeling the weight on his shoulders, straightened up. "We have to be more responsible. We can't afford to go back to our old way of life. I know it's going to be hard, but we have to learn to talk about it, to talk to others, not just to our friends, but to those who might feel rejected." He realized that their previous actions were not just mistakes, but part of their personal history that they now had a responsibility to change. Eric, who was always willing to support others, noticed his friends changing before his eyes. "We can't just apologize and forget about it. We have to take action. We need to create more than just talk. We need to take steps to help us and others realize the importance of this change." His confidence and passion compelled others to listen to his words. As they discussed their feelings, a realization emerged between them that their previous relationship could not be restored to what it had been. Their previous friendship was based on aggression and prejudice, but now they had the opportunity to build something deeper and more meaningful. They realized that they had a chance in their hands to create a space for dialogue, for sincere relationships and support. As they discussed their next steps, Tom talked about how important it was to support each other. "We can't do this alone. We have to be a support for each other. If one of us starts to lose confidence, the others have to help them." This was an important point for the group, as they realized that change would not be easy and would require support. Meanwhile, the evening air was beginning to cool, and the stars began to twinkle in the night sky like little lights of hope. At this point, the teens felt that they were not just discussing their actions, but that they were actually changing their lives. They were no longer just a group making fun of others. They had become a community willing to support each other and strive for change. Sam suddenly exclaimed, "Why don't we organize an event at school? We can invite people to come and tell their stories. Let everyone know that racism is not a joke. It is a reality that affects the lives of many." This idea created excitement in the group, and they began to discuss how to organize such an event. Each of them began to share their thoughts, how they could draw attention to the problem, how to tell others about their new views. They realized that change should be not only within their group, but also in the world around them, and this realization became a source of inspiration for them. Dan was reminded of the importance of continuing to speak up. Every time we see something wrong, we must have the courage to intervene. We can't stay on the sidelines. Every step we take will mean that we choose the path of respect. Those words sounded like a spell that united them. So, gradually, teenagers begin to realize that every choice they make has consequences, and these consequences can be not only negative, but also positive. It was the realization that they could become agents of change, able to influence their lives and the lives of those around them. When they finally went home, each of them felt that they had a new responsibility on their shoulders. Even though their journey had just begun, they knew that together they could overcome all challenges. A spark of hope for a future where respect and understanding would be more important than prejudice and hatred was born inside each of them. Each of them realized that it was their choices that would determine the mark they would leave on the world. It had been several days since a group of teenagers had encountered a black man in a park. Each of them, returning to their daily lives, felt that the world around them had changed. This incident was not just a memorable event for them, but a real lesson they couldn't forget. And now, when they met again, their faces were serious, determined, and hopeful. That evening, they gathered in a cozy room in Tom's house. The walls were decorated with posters and photos, creating an atmosphere of warmth and friendship. They wanted to discuss how best to communicate their new views to the others, so that no one else would repeat their mistakes. Each of them realized that they were not just teenagers, but potential leaders who could influence others and create a space of respect and understanding. Dan started the discussion. I think we should write a letter of apology, not just to our community, but to those we've hurt. It could be the first step to change." This idea resonated with everyone. They realized that admitting their mistakes was an important step toward redemption, and being open would help others see their serious intentions. Sam then suggested creating an event plan to educate. "We can organize meetings at school where we invite people who have experienced racism. Have them talk about their experiences. This will help others realize how important it is to be sensitive to other people's experiences." Support for this idea was a powerful impetus for action. They began discussing how to organize the event to attract as many people as possible. Eric, always ready for activism, stood up and said, "It's important that this is not just an event, but a real movement. We need to show that respect and understanding is something that can change society." His confidence infected the others, and they started throwing around ideas on how to get people involved, how to use social media to spread the word about upcoming events. Each of them realized that change requires not only words but also action. They began to discuss how important it is to have confidence in oneself and one's actions. When it comes to confronting bias and hate, confidence doesn't mean the absence of fear. Tom noted, "It means that we act in spite of it, and that's what we need right now." In the course of their discussions, they remembered the black man. His calmness and confidence left an indelible mark on their hearts. Sam said, "He showed us how important it is to maintain dignity and respect, even when others are being aggressive. It's not just about defending yourself, but being a voice for others." This moment was a turning point for everyone. They realized that their every word and action could have an impact on those around them. Each of them was part of something bigger, and they could not afford to stand aside when it came to justice. Jan adds, "We need to remind ourselves and others that change is possible. Each of us can be the one to initiate change, not only in our own lives, but in the lives of others." They began to talk about the importance of mutual help and support, and how important it is to build relationships on trust and respect. When the evening was over and the teens went home, each of them had an important lesson in their hearts. Confidence and respect are not just words, they are principles that can change the world. Each of them felt a sense of responsibility, that their choices and actions matter. And while the road to change may be long, they were ready to move forward, one step at a time, supporting each other. This experience was a beginning for all of them, opening the door to a new understanding and interaction with the world around them. They knew that each of them had the opportunity to change their behavior, change their environment, and inspire others to follow their example. The next morning, they eagerly began planning their actions. A group of teenagers, once deaf to the pain of others, were now ready to become agents of change. And there was something magical about it. They realized that together they could create a world where prejudice would have no place and respect would be the norm. In the end, each of them realized that change begins with themselves, and that only they can choose what their world will be like. And that choice, made with confidence and respect, became their gift for future generations. A few months have passed since a group of teenagers decided to change themselves and the world around them. Their efforts have begun to bear fruit. The school held events where guests shared their stories of prejudice and hatred, and the importance of respecting each other despite differences. Teenagers became actively involved in organizing events, working together to create an atmosphere of mutual understanding and support. They began to talk about their feelings, how important it is to consider the opinions of others, and how even small actions can affect society as a whole. Each of them realized that change is possible, and that it is in their power to create a brighter future. One day, while walking past the park where it all began, they stopped and looked at the spot where their paths crossed with a black man. That encounter left an indelible mark on their lives, becoming a powerful reminder of the power of confidence and respect. They remembered his wise words and the realization that each of them can make a difference in the world, starting with themselves. Every time they faced bias, they reacted differently. Instead of laughter and ridicule, they used their voices to defend those who could not stand up for themselves. They realized that together they could overcome any obstacle. In this journey, they not only changed their lives, but became an example to many. Their story has spread throughout the school and community, inspiring other youth leaders to be courageous and act with respect and justice. Each of them realized that this is not the end. This is just the beginning of a long journey where they can continue to learn, grow, and make the world a better place. And this realization gave them the strength to move forward, to wear the lessons they have learned with pride, and to share them with those who are willing to listen. In this way, the story of teenagers, once deaf to the pain of others, became a symbol of hope and change. Each of them was now ready to become an agent of change, and their voices grew louder and louder. With each new step, they opened the door to a future in which respect and understanding would be more important than hatred and prejudice. It was their lesson, a lesson for all that has lived on in people's hearts and inspired change. And it was their gift to the world, confidence, respect, and the opportunity for change.